25-year-old from Kitchener has agreed to be extradited to the U.S. to face charges related to a massive data breach.
I will not hesitate to increase this charge. If necessary, if the United States escalates, I will not hesitate to shut the electricity off completely.
With Ontarians, Ontario taxpayers that invested $2.5 billion into this EV project so we could create good jobs in the sector.
The United States doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, raising them to a staggering 50%. That decision didn't just strain a long-standing trade relationship. It triggered something much bigger. Just weeks later, Ontario finalized a $20 billion deal with Volkswagen to build one of North America's largest battery plants. The catch: not a single battery is destined for the U.S. Every cell produced in St. Thomas will be shipped directly to Europe. This isn't a trade hiccup. It's a signal that the North American economic map is being redrawn. Ontario is no longer betting on Washington. It's building a future with Brussels, and for the first time in decades, America is watching its closest economic partner quietly walk away.
The Volkswagen EV battery plant is a generational investment in St. Thomas and in all of Ontario and Canada.
Ontario didn't just react, it retaliated with precision. When the United States doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to a staggering 50% in early 2025, it sent a message of economic aggression. But Ontario's reply wasn't loud. It was calculated, surgical, and far more disruptive than most expected. Instead of filing WTO complaints or making diplomatic noise, Ontario turned to its most underappreciated weapon: energy. With the stroke of a policy pen, a 25% surcharge was quietly imposed on electricity exports to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. 3 states critically reliant on Ontario's clean, stable energy to power hospitals, water treatment plants, public transportation, and industrial production. It was a tit for tat, but one that struck at the heart of daily life. Ontario didn't aim for headlines, it aimed for pressure points and hit them. But that was just the opening move. The real statement came weeks later in bricks, concrete, and long-term planning. Ontario announced a $20 billion deal with Volkswagen to construct one of the largest electric vehicle battery plants in North America, located in St. Thomas. It's a generational investment, one that reshapes Ontario's industrial identity. But the twist: every single battery cell produced there, from the first test run to the millionth, is destined for Europe. Not one will be shipped to the United States. That's not a business coincidence. That's a geopolitical message. Ontario has chosen its future trade direction, and Washington isn't on the route. Why such a dramatic cut from its largest historical trade partner? Because Europe offers something the U.S. no longer can: stability. Ontario's clean tech sector doesn't just need funding. It needs predictable policy, long-term climate commitments, and consistent cross-border regulations. Europe provides all three. The United States, under repeated policy swings, shifting tax rules, and volatile trade measures, has become too risky a partner. Ontario isn't throwing a tantrum, it's drawing a roadmap. And Europe, with its green transition plans, carbon pricing, and locked-in EV quotas, is a far more attractive long-term buyer than a U.S. market constantly rewriting its own rules. Meanwhile, American automakers are caught in a storm. With tariffs raising the cost of essential parts, federal tax credits under political attack, and state-level emission standards clashing with federal deregulation, the landscape is chaos. Ontario watched the drama unfold and decided to build elsewhere. In Europe, the incentives are clear. The market is unified. The rules don't shift with every press conference. And perhaps the most remarkable part: all of this is happening without fanfare. No viral press conferences, no trade war headlines, no shouting matches between premiers and presidents. Instead, Ontario is executing a quiet strategic pivot. Power lines are being rerouted, battery contracts are being reallocated, and supply chains once linked to Detroit are being severed and redirected to Hamburg and Rotterdam. The silence isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of resolve. America's loss isn't just in tax revenue or missed contracts, it's symbolic. It marks the first time in modern Canadian history that a province has so clearly chosen to reorient its economic gravity away from the U.S. and toward Europe, not because of ideology, but because of reliability. In an era where trust is currency, Ontario is cashing out of a volatile partnership and reinvesting in predictability. This is not revenge, it's realignment. And the message is unambiguous: if your rules can't be trusted, your market won't be prioritized. Ontario has made its choice. The future its factories, energy exports, and investment flows is heading east, not south. The tariff war may have started with numbers on a page: 50% duties on Canadian steel and aluminum, but its effects are now rippling through every artery of North American trade. Ontario didn't just push back with words, it retaliated with power, literally, by imposing a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to Michigan, New York, and Minnesota. This wasn't symbolic. It hit where it hurt. Those states rely on Ontario for up to 30% of their imported electricity. The message: if Washington uses economic leverage, Ontario can too. But this isn't just a back and forth of trade penalties. It marks the beginning of something far more profound, a deliberate realignment of capital partnerships and industrial direction. Ontario's $20 billion deal with Volkswagen to build a battery gigafactory in St. Thomas is now the centerpiece of that shift. The most striking part: not a single battery is destined for the United States. All production, backed by subsidies, infrastructure, and political will, is locked into European contracts. It's a quiet but decisive divorce from America's volatile trade policy. This pivot doesn't stop at EVs. Ontario is reshaping its entire trade network. Ports in Quebec are expanding capacity to meet growing transatlantic demand, while provincial infrastructure projects now prioritize connections to European shipping lanes and standards. Even energy policy is being restructured with continental decoupling in mind. Power lines and grid planning are now tools of foreign policy, no longer mere utilities. Ontario is building resilience not just against U.S. tariffs, but against the instability they represent. Meanwhile, Washington's unpredictability, flip-flopping policies, midterm tariff escalations, and unratified agreements has made it an unreliable partner. European nations, by contrast, offer climate-aligned goals, ESG compliance, and long-term consistency. For Canadian leaders and corporate boards, that stability is a better bet. The result is clear. The traditional north-south flow of goods, energy, and investment is being replaced by an eastward current. Ontario is not just diversifying, it's choosing. And for the first time in decades, that choice excludes the United States. This isn't a trade disagreement anymore. It's a redrawing of the North American map. This isn't just a policy story. It's a complete economic rewiring, and it's happening block by block, rail by rail, paycheck by paycheck across Ontario. Start with jobs. In St. Thomas, over 3,000 workers are being retrained to meet Volkswagen's production standards for one of the largest battery plants in North America. Unlike past trade strategies built around cross-border auto assembly with Detroit, this facility is explicitly designed for Europe. That means different engineering specifications, stricter environmental benchmarks, and a fully export-oriented infrastructure. Local unions are adapting training programs not for U.S. safety standards, but for EU certification. Blue-collar workers who once built parts for Ford in Michigan are now learning how to meet German recycling laws and EU digital monitoring rules. Then come the roads, ports, and power lines. New railway extensions from northern Ontario mining hubs are being laid toward Quebec's Atlantic ports, bypassing U.S. border crossings entirely. Container yards in Montreal and Halifax are undergoing upgrades to match European customs and transport logistics. Power stations are also being retooled not just to serve local grids, but to export electricity on fixed contracts to European firms under Canada-EU climate agreements. The North-South model of trade, long the default, is quietly giving way to a transatlantic system. Meanwhile, Canada's core economic engines are quietly shifting their gears. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, CPPIB, and OMERS have reduced exposure to U.S. assets for the third year in a row and are now funneling billions into EU-based green tech hubs, particularly in Germany, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia. These aren't short-term reallocations, they're long-term trust plays. Analysts cite U.S. political unpredictability, volatile tariffs, and repeated contract reversals as reasons for the reallocation. European markets, in contrast, offer clear, ESG-compliant, stable trade regimes and stronger intellectual property protections. And the financial architecture is changing too. In 2022, nearly 80% of Canadian international transactions were cleared in U.S. dollars. By mid-2025, that figure is down to 63%, with euros and yen steadily gaining share. Canadian companies working in clean energy, aerospace, and advanced manufacturing now price long-term contracts in non-dollar currencies to hedge against U.S. policy shocks. In a world where financial reliability is power, this quiet shift away from dollar dominance is not symbolic. It's structural. This isn't a one-off battery deal. It's not a temporary detour. What's happening on the ground in Ontario signals something much larger, a deliberate, durable move away from American economic gravity. From factories to freight systems, from paychecks to pensions, the signals are unmistakable. The future of Canadian trade is no longer tied exclusively to Washington. It's sailing east. Ontario's pivot is no longer just a provincial maneuver, it's a signal flare for all of North America. What began as a localized reaction to Washington's tariffs has evolved into a broader strategic recalibration by Canada as a whole. In 2025, the shift is unmistakable. Ottawa is deliberately redrawing its diplomatic and economic boundaries. Prime Minister Mark Carney made headlines by skipping Washington for his first state visit, choosing Paris, instead a symbolic gesture that spoke volumes. And it didn't stop there. Canada quietly froze its $19 billion F-35 fighter jet deal with the U.S., sending a clear message: economic trust and defense ties now hang in the balance. The Volkswagen battery deal in Ontario, the 25% energy surcharge to U.S. border states, and the rerouting of trade flows to Europe are not isolated moves. They are part of a larger playbook. European investors are replacing American ones. Canadian pension funds are flowing east. And Europe, through stable climate policy, long-term industrial incentives, and reliable regulations, is rapidly becoming the new default partner. What was once a continent defined by a U.S. Canada production axis is shifting. And this time Washington isn't in control. This raises a hard question for policymakers, businesses, and citizens on both sides of the border. Is this just a temporary flashpoint, or are we witnessing a permanent realignment? The indicators suggest the latter. Canada's moves from its energy grid to its air bases reflect more than frustration. They reveal a country reassessing its role in the global economy and actively building alternatives to U.S. dominance. The message is clear. Canada isn't reacting anymore. It's redirecting. From steel and aluminum to batteries and pension portfolios, the entire economic architecture is being rebuilt with different allies in mind. And while the United States wrestles with internal uncertainty, Canada is crafting its own future, one anchored in predictability, sovereignty, and diversification. If you care about the future of North American trade, about supply chains that once defined global industries, about where your energy and products come from, now is the time to pay attention. Because this isn't just a shift in policy, it's a shift in purpose. Share this story, talk about it, debate it, and stay tuned, because in the next segment we'll break down how Europe is stepping into the vacuum America left behind and why that could permanently reshape the continent's economic destiny.